Hi, everyone. I'm Leanna Gamber-Thompson, Digital Project and Operations Manager here at EdSurge. EdSurge is a news and information resource helping bring you the best in education technology through our news stories, research programs, and community activities, which include live conferences and events like this webinar. At the end of last year, EdSurge joined ISTE, and ISTE stands for the International Society for Technology and Education. ISTE is a nonprofit organization that serves educators interested in the use of technology in education. For today's webinar, we've lined up a great group of administrators and educators for a conversation about how to turn bad data into good data. A quick note before we begin, the webinar is going to be recorded, so the recording will be made available to you after the live event via email. So I want to start by thanking Agile Education Marketing for the support that makes this webinar possible. Agile Education is the top marketing intelligence provider focused solely on the education market. And Verlin, one of our panelists today, is a co-founder of Agile, so excited to get his opinion. You may ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature or the chat function. So if you want your question to really be seen by the panelists, go ahead and stick it in the Q&A feature. We'll also be monitoring the chat, so you can stick questions in there, but if you really want to make sure that we see them, please use the Q&A feature. Feel free to chat with each other in the chat function, introduce yourself, your location. If you have ideas and resources, bring them in as we go through the conversation. So I want to introduce the panelists on today's call. They're a really great group. We're joined by Ashley Chitwood. She's the Vice President of Marketing and Enrollment Management at Naropa University. That's in Boulder, Colorado. Javier Encinas is the Vice President of Marketing at Accelerate Learning. And Accelerate Learning is a research-based national leader in pre-K to 12 STEM curriculum. And Verlin Stevens, who I mentioned earlier, he's a managing partner and CIO at Agile Education Marketing. All right, so I want to kind of set the stage for today's conversation by looking at a couple slides. This first slide here is based on some research from Experian and Financial Times. And this relates to the data that businesses rely on, including third-party data and in-house data. You can see that it is a constantly moving target. So 7.6% of contacts go bad each quarter. So that's every 3 months. Unless you think that is an insignificant amount, by 2025, customer data will amount to 163 billion terabytes. I think that's what all those zeros translate into. So the portion of the bad data that directly translates into financial losses is $3 trillion. So the big takeaway here is that it's really crucial for companies to practice good data hygiene and put a plan in place for how to do it. Whether you're a small company, whether you're one person handling all the data management, or whether you're a large company, we'll talk about kind of some tips and strategies for how to practice good data hygiene and put a plan in place for how to do it. All right, so what about the education industry specifically? This info is taken from Agile's education data, and you can see it's actually a really dynamic market. You can see that these changes that are shown here have occurred in just a 2-month period. So this is kind of an example of a report that Agile might share with some of its clients. They collect PK to 20 data, and you can see how much turnover there is just in 2 months. So there are personnel changes. This is pretty straightforward. You know, a teacher might change roles or schools. There are email changes, and this happens actually more frequently than you might imagine. Districts sometimes change their entire domain names, with Google now occupying 55% of the education email market. And Verlin can speak to this a little bit more as well. So if your company is using sort of outdated domain info to reach out, then you risk being blackballed or running into domain reputation issues. And of course, one thing that I don't think about very often is that schools sometimes change physical locations. So they might remodel, 2 schools might merge, etc. And this can be a real problem in higher ed as well if you're mailing out physical samples to a school. So there are lots of turnover issues that you can run into. What's the bottom line? Things are constantly changing in the education market, and it's really so important to try to stay on top of those changes. In fact, someone that I was talking to from Agile mentioned that some folks are cleaning their data on a weekly basis, that there's so much change going on. All right, so that's our setup, but let's get to our panelists' perspectives on managing data. They represent a really nice, diverse range of experiences. So Ashley's in higher ed, Javier works in K-12, and I know they have a lot of great advice for you. So I've asked the panelists to speak to a couple specific questions and then to give some tips and experiences from the field. And then after that, we'll open it up to audience questions. If you have them, again, feel free to use the chat or that Q&A button. Okay, so let's start off with Ashley. Ashley, tell us why laying a solid foundation is so important when you set out to collect data of any kind.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to really approach this from a novice perspective, because as I enter in new organizations, whether it's the private sector or public sector, a small organization or a big organization, it has served me and the business I'm helping well to come in with a novice mindset. I think we take for granted as education leaders and business leaders that things are working, or we're reporting and collecting the data that's necessary to help us build stories and ideals for what it is we're trying to create. And oftentimes what I find is what we believe to be true, or what other businesses or leaders expect to be true, is happening. And when I come in from a perspective of help me understand, teach me how this works, and you'll get some one-liners from me, but I always ask and say, I assume everything's broken when I come into places, and if things are working great, fantastic, but if they're not, at least I've found opportunities. So when you're building a foundation, I think it is really important to put your perceptions of what you've created aside on occasion and often to reflect on what it is you're collecting. Are your operations in place to collect the data that you need? I say, garbage in, garbage out. If what you're collecting is not helping you, what you put out with that data is not going to tell the story you need to drive sales, to drive revenue, and to even give insights into your operations. Data is used for not only how we go to market and how we project things, but it also is a guiding principle for how we maneuver our human resources. So coming at it from a novice level foundational perspective is a seat that I would encourage everybody to take at one point in time, whether you're new or a well-established institution or business, to take a look at that. Sometimes it's ego that gets in the way of us saying, did you check the power? Is it turned on? Is it plugged in? What is the outcome of the report that you want to see? And then how do you reverse engineer that? So reverse engineering what it is you're trying to accomplish, and back that all the way down to what you're collecting, how you're collecting it, and how you're actually building back up to that end result is really important, and something that just these bare basics are often missed by a lot of businesses, or we get complacent, and no one likes to think that they've become complacent in their business, but sometimes taking a look in the mirror and pointing the finger at yourself is the best way to really take a look at that foundation and make sure that you're set up for success. Reviewing this type of thing on a regular basis is important, but to do maybe a deep dive of what I'm explaining on an annual basis with your leadership team, or a team of people who manages different areas of your business, whether it's marketing, sales, operations, obviously your IT team, but how do you get everyone together once a year and review what it is you're collecting, how you're collecting it, and making sure that the experience that not only your internal staff understand, but if you have outward consumers that are working through your system that is creating the data that you see, what is their experience and how are the changes you're making impact that? That includes establishing what you have as best practices. Do you have a committee to review these foundations? Do you have a committee who reviews what I call a data cookbook? A lot of different institutions call this different things, But a data cookbook essentially allows everyone to be on the same page of what definitions of certain terms are. In higher education, how do you define an inquiry in an applicant or an enrollment? What are retained students? What are at-risk students? And how are those defined and how do we measure those? So having a data cookbook and something to always point back to make sure we're aligned with what we're trying to capture and what data we're using to establish what goals and what outcomes. So having that set up, and if you don't have something like that set up, I highly encourage you to do that as part of evaluating a foundation to not only the data you're collecting now, but how you'll collect data in the future. And I think having those things is a good precedent for setting a foundation to getting good data or improving the data you have to get the answers you need.
Amazing. So many great tips in such a short amount of time. Thank you, Ashley. I love that idea of a novice mindset and kind of going back to square one and saying, you know, what are we doing right here? What can we do better? Not kind of being too confident and really reassessing. I think that's great advice. I want to turn it over to Javier now to talk a little bit more about the K-12 space. And you're sort of coming at this, Javier, from a marketer's perspective. So once you've laid that foundation, what's your number one tip for kind of using that data effectively on the ground?
Sure, no problem. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I want to start first with my approach is, in the K-12 market, I've worked for some larger publishers as well as some smaller startups. And the landscape is different for every one of us, depending on where we're at. So in most of the cases, we are supporting a field-based or an inside sales organization, and we're working with CRMs. And in those CRMs, we have two options. We can import data from a reputable data provider that will continuously update that for us, and we do pay for that data and subsets of it. Or we can maintain that CRM on our own and rely on our feet on the street, our sales reps, to inform that. And to an extent that is helpful for that field rep that's cold calling and that is working a subset of accounts that they've been assigned. But as a marketer, our job is to canvass the market, identify where the needs are, what the pain points are of different folks in that market, and then provide them with the solutions that are available from us in order to solve those pain points. So with that, your CRM sales rep managed only model may not work very well because the data may not be as reliable. It may be outdated very quickly, or you have turnover with your sales rep and an account isn't being managed. So from my perspective, I think what I want to approach is talking about one size not fitting all. Ensuring your data is accurate enough for you to segment the message that you're sending out to the market is extremely important. If your brand is associated with just the I call it pay and spray sort of model, where you're just pumping and pumping and pumping the same message to everybody, your brand is not going to have the solution-oriented focus that you would like. People aren't going to immediately resonate you with somebody that can solve their problem. They're going to resonate your brand with somebody who's just trying to sell and sell and sell and isn't really concerned about what their individual unique needs are. So making sure that the data is quality data when you're sending that message out and those differentiated messages is extremely key. And then I want to touch again that having that solutions-based approach is always a key to ensuring that your brand has fidelity. And having the right data in order to communicate the right message to the right person is where that starts. So that's kind of the core message that I want to send across after I've established how I'm going to manage my data. And that's why it's so important for me to have good data.
Oh, it's not a webinar until someone talks while they're on mute. I just did it. But also really great tips from you, Javier, about how to effectively use your good data and why it's so important to have good data in the first place, because you can't do that kind of segmentation. You can't use that kind of solutions approach if you have the wrong data. So Verlin, let's turn it over to you. I feel like Ashley and Javier have kind of just described a best case scenario, right? Like you've laid a really solid foundation for your data collection. You're using it in a smart way by speaking to different audiences in unique ways, by segmenting, by being smart about how you use your data. what happens if you have a company where you're in a position where either you kind of don't know where to start with this, or even worse, your data's a mess? What are some tips that you can give us? What should I do if I'm a company and I'm like, I don't even know where to start with this?
Thanks. I appreciate that, Liana. You know, and you hit it very early on. We see this massive turnover in this industry, but it's not atypical from other industries as well, where we see about a 20% annual turnover rate. And so there is a constant churn of people coming and going. There's constantly new buildings coming on and others closing and whatever. And so it's a very living environment. So there's always a change. And, you know, we see a lot of people come to us kind of at their worst, where they've got a crisis. They can't roll up and do management reporting. They can't do territory planning. They can't create a presentation for the CEO on what market opportunity size is. You know, those type of things are what suddenly make people go, our CRM is unusable. We can't even do the basics of reporting here, let alone getting to more advanced things like Javier was talking about in terms of segmentation and really getting the right message to the right person. And so, you know, we see that around, and it really boils down to a couple of things where we see it's either a lack of accuracy or a lack of completeness. So do you really know that you have all the schools in the country? Are you really sure that the information you have is accurate? Is the enrollment this year's enrollment or 5 years ago's enrollment? And it's those type of questions that really get down to the core of how good is the information that you have, and do you really have the processes in place to keep from, you know, not only can you get out of that hole, but can you stay out of it? And I think that's really the pieces that become key. And I talk with clients a lot about, you know, it's a matter of, you know, get it clean and then keep it clean. And it's really two components. And the get it clean piece is really identifying where you have data problems. We see all the time, we were talking about it just yesterday, where the building name gets used as a dump all field for all kinds of things. Oh, dash dash closed. Oh, parentheses duplicate. And you're like, why do you put that in the title of the building? The main account name suddenly gets garbaged with all this other stuff. Try and get those kind of things under control. And Ashley said it with the data cookbook or data dictionary, data governance, whatever you kind of want to call it. But it's a matter of saying, we're going to treat our data as a real valuable asset, and we're going to work to keep it clean once we get it there. And to get it there is a one step at a time process. You know, you got to work on, you identify where the biggest problems are. Are they duplicates? Are they lack of data? Are they inaccurate data? And start chipping away at each of those pieces that when you look at it as a whole, it seems insurmountable. But once you start to break it down into the component pieces, it's really something that's very, you know, it's certainly well within the capability of doing. You know, there are only, you know, 150,000 K-12 schools in the country, 7,000 higher ed organizations. You know, you get into people, it gets a bit larger there, but that's where you really need a data partner. But on the basics, we're not talking about, you know, millions and millions of institutions. We're talking about a pretty manageable set.
Yeah, and I think that kind of relates to something that I want to ask Ashley, which is, you know, you talked a little bit about this idea of putting together a data cookbook and then involving multiple stakeholders. So the question that I have for you is, by doing that and by sort of taking a step back, I think a lot of us really look at data as something really impersonal, but what does it mean to humanize the data? And I think I'll start with Ashley, but I think any of you can kind of speak to this, you know, Javier, particularly with like that solutions approach. What does it mean to take sort of an approach to your data management or your data hygiene, what does it mean to humanize the data, and how can that help?
Sure. So looking at it from a couple different perspectives, that as business leaders and people who are usually sitting around the table, who oftentimes are in a data governance committee or group, you're looking at, are things working? You know, is there something broken? Are we tasked with an initiative to find a gap or a problem within our institution that we have to solve for? And you can use that data to find our holes or the red flags or those buoy measures that we put in place to say, okay, when something's going wrong, this is what's going to trigger us to reflect on what is occurring and dig a little bit deeper. And it's easy for that group to say, oh, look at this hole over here, or look at this this problem number, that's in the red. We must do something. And the seat that we take as data governance, oftentimes leaders of a certain division or department, is to act on those numbers without thinking about the impact it has on not only the people who work within that specific area that have to do with how those numbers are reflected, but the actions we take as leaders or in data governance impacts a consumer, impacts the end user, or even the beginning user really of that experience. And so to make an action or take an action on a alarming number or a number that gets us excited because we see dollar signs to it, those are natural reactions, but we have to take a step back before we initiate an action or a directive to impact what we see in the numbers, to ensure that what we do isn't going to hurt our consumers, our students, our customers, and it's actually going to land well and support their overall experience. I've seen too frequently businesses who decide to act quickly on their numbers and results just to find out they have upset consumers or students who are blasting social media because of a change that we thought was going to support an infrastructure or going to improve our revenue by X%. And we completely remove the people who are being impacted by those decisions. And so when we talk about in data governance that I support, humanizing this is before we act, let's walk through the process of the impact and end result of what it is we need to decide. And remembering that it is people at the end of the day who are supporting what drives data.
So
yeah, go ahead, Javier.
Leanna, on my end. So humanizing on my end is, you're going to keep hearing this theme from me, solution oriented or solution based oriented. I truly believe in a mission and always working for a company that's going to offer value to our K-12 educators, because it's hard enough out there for them already on their own. And when we're selling into those schools and districts, I want to ensure that we're selling the right program, the right product, the right tool, or offering free tools that are going to assist them in their day-to-day challenges. So as we all know, whether it's ELA, math, science, they're rated on high stakes tests. That's the end game. They have to make sure that their students are performing and are experiencing the lessons that they need to, or the daily activities that are going to help them understand and get to performance on those high stakes tests. So what I like to do when I humanize things is using a good data set. I'll analyze, for example, what districts in California or in the Southwest are having difficulty performing. A good data partner will be able to give me that information. Then I take it from there and I say, okay, let me look at the subset of this district. And I may look at elementary teachers who have to teach multiple disciplines and put myself in the shoes of that elementary teacher. And then me and my team will decide or determine, either based on focus groups, based on our experience, or based on just feedback from our current customers, what they deal with as a pain point on a daily basis. And then we'll design programs in order to deliver free resources or resources that could be tied to solutions our program offers. And if I didn't understand that was a low performing school and that they were having those pain points, I wouldn't know what kind of message to send them. But we also send those messages empathetically. We're not just trying to sell them a car for the sake of selling them a car.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and particularly good advice too, that you use the data in conjunction with other methods like focus groups and relying on your own instinct and your own experience. You're not just kind of making these hasty decisions like Ashley mentioned when you see something exciting in the data. So Verlin, I don't know if you have anything to say. What are some of the pitfalls of moving quickly on the data, without kind of humanizing it first?
Yeah, let me hit a couple of things that, to key off of a little bit what Javier said there. understanding who you're talking to, their role, what kind of district or what kind of school they're in, and what they're how well they're performing is so key. You know, we did a big effort in training our sales team around our student performance data. We took 2 of the schools here in Denver. They're 4 miles apart. One is one of the highest performing schools in the state, and one is on the improvement list. They're one of the lowest performing schools. And yet, when you look at them superficially, they both have almost the same enrollment. The buildings were built about the same time period. You know, superficially, they're both part of Denver Public Schools. They both look identical. When you really start to dig into the numbers and you look at them, though, one has a very high Title I school, one's a low Title I school. One of them has a lot of ELL students in it, the other one does not. And so you start to get in, you start to say, oh, I can see differences here. When we literally sat down and we talked to the principals at those 2 schools, the one at the high performing school, we said, what's your biggest challenge? She said, managing these parents. And yet the other one said, I've got to build a reputation in my community that this is a school you'd want to send your kids to, and improving the test scores is part of that. And so every one of them needs something different. And the more you understand about that, the better off you're going to be in having a message that resonates. Just sending out a, hey, we can help improve your test scores. I can tell you the principal at the high performing school, it's not at the top of her list. She's got communication issues. The one at the other end, that's his challenge. And so being able to personalize that and get that down to, as Javier said, it's the right message to the right person at the right time. It's really critical. And to do that, you know, it's building on your data and understanding each of those people and who you're working with, and being able to segment them down so that the message is appropriate for them.
And I want to kind of stay on this thread of kind of additional pain points that you're seeing from the folks that you're working with. So in the intro, I kind of mentioned the fact that Google has 55% of the email market. I think Microsoft has another 25%. So, you know, that's one issue when you're sending out like emails to the wrong folks, the wrong lists, you can run into real problems. But what are some other specific pain points or problems that you're seeing from your clients, Berlin or Javier, and Ashley, feel free to chime in as well, when they're relying on bad data?
And you kind of hit on it there, Liana. It's really around, you know, the whole email landscape over the last few years has really changed to be extremely engagement driven. So both Microsoft and especially Google determine your inbox placement and things based on engagement. So as a campaign starts to go out, they look both at that campaign and historically your campaigns to say, how do people engage with this? If they engage well, you know, it's your bill from American Express, they get a high engagement rate. Everybody opens that so they can pay it. They send out millions and millions. They don't have a problem with that. And so being able to drive engagement is so critical these days. And there's real consequence to it. If you get blocked by Google or get delayed in their ability to deliver, Microsoft is infamous for that, suddenly you can lose 25%, 50%, or more of your audience is blocked from seeing your message. That suddenly makes your marketing just tank. And nobody wants to be in a position where they've gone over the threshold of, oh, we weren't driving enough engagement, and so Google's decided we're spammy. That's a terrible place to be.
So I'm gonna jump in too. There's sort of 2 pain points I want to talk about. One of them is, and Berlin touched on it already, if you receive a high volume of opt-outs, you've eliminated your opportunity to send the right message to that person at the right time. So I'll just leave it at that. I don't need to belabor that. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and we watch our opt-out rates very closely and try and understand why we're receiving opt-outs. But I'm going to take a step out. I'm going to look at this from an executive standpoint, and I'm going to look at it by my sales team and the cost of a sales organization. So taking the marketing lead out of the mix that's handed to a salesperson to nurture, or a marketing engine to nurture, our sales team uses data on a daily basis in order to structure their day of their cold calling, in order to identify an area that they want to build their territory in. Or for our inside reps, they use the data in order to target from a sales marketing perspective with cadences that they've set up. If our data is wrong or we don't have effective data in our CRM for those sales reps, they're spinning their wheels. And the cost of a sales rep or the opportunity cost of lost revenue of that sales rep time is huge. And we see that in the top line if we're not arming them with what they need.
Ashley, do you want to add anything about kind of in the higher ed space particularly? What are some dangers of relying on outdated or bad data?
Sure. I actually speak to what Javier said because I'm speaking as a higher education administrator who is a recipient of many of those emails. And I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, the things I opt out of damage my perception of what that business is or what they're going to offer me, even if it could be of value to my organization. It's the approach, it's the wrong message, it's misspelling my name. It's things like that that do matter that I won't give you the time of day. It's just it's an opt out, it's a delete. And I, in the back of my mind, I remember that. So, it drives home what both Javier and Berlin said about really taking care of those details, because those details, you have missed opportunity over things that should just be really simple if you just put a little more focus into it. So speaking as a consumer from that perspective, from my perspective of with marketing and sales, and specifically looking at the recruitment of students, not having the appropriate fields set up to collect the right data for us has been the biggest challenge. I mean, we have a lot of new students that we need to work coming in and monitor how they move through our CRM and how they experience our brand. But when we go back to look at historical data or data to represent, the life cycle of a student, 4 years more or less for an undergraduate, and do they continue into graduate education? That data not being connected for us is a really big problem. How do you connect a student coming in and carry as much information forward through the different systems, whether it's SIS or through a CRM, but how do you connect all those data points? You're using old data to marry new data 4 years later to build a story about that student journey that becomes disconnected. And so I think in addition to carrying forward information you collect on the front end and somehow connecting it on the back end becomes really important, because that data, it becomes outdated and not relevant when it's not connected. And so it's a different perspective, I suppose, from what Javier and Berlin have, but from my internal higher education perspective, not having those things connected become a bigger hindrance for us. As well as how do we find more students that retain and more students that graduate, and what are those initial findings that we don't carry forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and made me think too about a question I had for each of you, which is, what about sort of the little guys, right? So Javier mentioned kind of trying not to put the onus on his sales team to track like every last detail in Salesforce or whatever, or in the CRM. So, like that just creates sort of a nightmare situation for the sales team. But what happens when you're in a university setting or a startup setting where it's like one person who's having to kind of manage all of this? What tips would you have for smaller companies who are trying to kind of do their best with what they have? I don't know, Verlin, if you want to start, if you might have any tips.
We work with companies of all different sizes, from some of the largest educational publishers to, people that are, literally a 2-3 person operation. And their challenges are all different in terms of that, but it comes down to, and Javier kind of said it, that you don't want your sales team being your data entry staff to start with. So if you don't have a big sales team, you're never tempted to say, oh, we'll just let our salespeople do all these updates. Well, we make 1 million outbound phone calls a year gathering information. Are you going to ask your sales team to call districts and gather enrollment and talk to each school to make sure the enrollment numbers are right? You're not. It doesn't make any sense. You're so much better off to just license that information and get it from another source where somebody else is worrying about the gathering of that information. Have we touched every school, and when's the last time this person was talked to, and go through that whole data management. There's no reason that there's no way to cost effectively do that in a small organization, or frankly even in a large organization. It doesn't make sense. You don't want your sales team, you want them selling, not being data entry clerks.
Yeah, that's great advice. Javier, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on two things. I see a question too that I'm going to answer as well, at least from
Great. I was just looking at this.
So, and I think Berlin could probably answer that too. But from my perspective, having started or worked with a couple of small startups, we didn't have the budget dollars. We had a tiny marketing team of 2 or 3 people. We didn't have the budget dollars to do a huge national data lease. So we really isolated with data partners, either hot regions that we had to, sorry, that is Houston traffic for me. We really isolated markets that we wanted to incubate first so that we can minimize the cost of a data lease, or we worked with data partners to target, and we would just purchase data for very focused subsets. Like I said, we only want special people that are focused on special ed in this market, or even down to the zip code, and that really helps you isolate the cost down where it's manageable, so that you're not spending money where you don't need to, and then you just grow into the relationship. I'm going to answer the question that I see in the Q&A, and I am not going to say that name right, so I'm not even going to try. But the question is, how frequently do you perform a database health check, and what are some important data points to examine when assessing database health? Where do you draw the line in terms of removing and deleting contacts from your database? So we actually do that once a year, but we also do have a system set up where our database, we set up parameters where it pulls in and out from our data provider on a daily basis, updates, so that we're as updated as possible with our data providers' information. So it's continuous, but then every year we will also take a upload and we will evaluate whether or not we have good or bad data, and then we'll make the determination then on whether we're going to remove or delete any contacts from it. Usually that's a process I go through because I have a larger sales team, so I'll go through that with our sales territory managers. We won't just do a full dump from a marketing perspective because we use the data hand in hand. So,
Ashley, what about you? What about in your context, to speak to Vinod's question about performing a database health check? What do you do in your context?
For us specifically, I'm always looking at it from the point of the consumer. So I put myself through that journey for us specifically, and how do we, what communications do we have? What are those steps? What are the triggers? And how do those triggers allow communications to go out when communications need to stop? What stop gaps need to happen if a student, in our case, runs into a hurdle, and how are we aware of those hurdles? And so obviously we're measuring that on the back end and looking at how they progress through a CRM and move forward through that. But my first go from a marketing enrollment perspective is attempting to see that through as a consumer and replicate their experience to guide me in what we do next with the CRM.
And Verlin, I mean, you work, as you said, with companies, with clients of many types and sizes. What would you say here about a data health check?
A couple of things. So, on our side in maintaining our big database, we remove any contacts that we haven't verified in 24 months. So they get scrubbed off fairly quickly, and we look very specifically at who didn't get even done after a year. So our goal is to touch every person every year, and then we go back and analyze, well, where do we have, are there any clusters of people that we weren't able to contact, particular types of things. So, we're very active about looking at that and then scrubbing off things that we can't validate. So, because we're pushing that out on a weekly basis to our clients, we really want that information to be highly accurate, and we do not only the kind of big checks like that, but we also pull data samples very frequently and do a real check on that. Are we running the kind of 92 to 95% accuracy rate that is our internal goals? is the data living up to that on a daily basis?
We have a couple more questions, which I want to get to. Ben Garner put 3 questions in the chat, 2 of which I will ask Verlin right now. They're more agile data set specific questions. I also want to give a shout out to Ben for asking about Javier's skin routine. Javier says sunscreen, 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 sunscreen. So if you have one takeaway from today's webinar, don't tell we're not giving, don't believe that we're not giving you any tips here. But Ben has a question. Do you have a way to track individuals moving into new positions in new states or school districts?
You know, we don't, that there is no universal numbering system for educators across the country. The NCS or nobody provides a way to do that. We do track within a district movement, and we've done that for many years now. And so we can see kind of their progression. This person was a high school principal, and a middle school principal, now they're director of elementary education, and we can see that movement. We've done some experimentation. We had a client, in fact, we still do, that wanted a report done quarterly on superintendent movement. So we really looked at superintendents and can we track them across the country. And what we did there is we eliminated all the I want to say 500 most common surnames. So the Andersons, the Davises, the Jones, because they're just not unique enough to be able to track that person. There currently exists, my recollection, 4 or 5 Steve Andersons as superintendents. So I can't differentiate one from the other. And you can't even do it kind of geographically. Superintendents, for instance, will move clear across country for a great opportunity. We saw a few years ago, the super in Boston came all the way from San Francisco. So there's no way to even geographically kind of do that. But with eliminating those most common surnames, we really got down to a set that was, we felt 85, 90% accurate, where we could track these really key decision makers and their movement. So we've done some special projects around that. We've had success in doing that. It's not 100%, and so you've got to have a little bit of a conversation that says, we think this is 85+% accurate, and that way you can see where these superintendents moving. You know, in general, I think the way I try and work with clients is look at it more on a territory basis. So I built some reports like in our Salesforce demo that says, who are the new superintendents or new principals in my territory? And so every week you can see who's coming on, and then you can start a dialogue to introduce yourself, introduce your product, whatever it is that might make sense there. So tracking across the country, very difficult. We've done it in some isolated pieces. The other question Ben had was really about teacher certification numbers. And we do gather a lot of information predominantly around highest degree earned and the people's certification. I'll have to go look. I don't think I've ever been asked a question about the certification number. We may actually have that information. I don't believe we publish it, but we may actually have a fair amount of that information. We can certainly look at that, reach out to either myself or any of the sales team here at Agile, and we'd be glad to dig in and see if that's something that we either have or we could gather as part of the process where we gather that information currently.
Super helpful. Thank you, Verlin. And we actually have 3 more questions in the Q&A here, so I want to make sure that we get to at least some of them. EAF has a question. Are companies being proactive in meeting the EdFi data standards to help with interoperability?
On my end, I can answer that, that yes, our company is very focused on that. That does run through our technology department. So it's a little separate of marketing, but in our marketing efforts, depending on who we're talking to and what solution we're pushing out in the space, we'll message that based on some of the larger urban districts that we've been able to identify have subscribed to that.
Okay. And we have another question from Amanda Chang. She says, how do you use data to target and recruit users for user research? How does your approach differ for current users of your product versus non-users or leads? Javier, do you want to take that one too?
Yeah, I'll take that one. That sounds very product focused.
Yeah.
I'll use the database to identify, like I said, if we are trying to develop an emerging product or a companion product. we'll look at it in two sets. We'll look at it in the set of our existing customers, and we'll look at usage data to determine whether or not we want to split it between people who are low users, high users, just dependent on, on what we're looking at asking in that study. Or we will go to our third-party data vendor, and we'll identify who our sample audience is going to be. And usually I'll have a third-party research firm I'm working with, and then we'll tap into that database and we'll deploy it, usually through an anonymous measure to make sure that we get the right information back. So I hope that answered your question, but I do use the data internally from our CRM, keeping it super clean so that we can understand our customers. And then also through our prospecting database, we'll access that, but we usually work with a third-party research company.
Any other thoughts on user research or how to manage your own data versus lead data? Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question from an anonymous attendee. Is there a service, this is a very practical question, is there a service you recommend using for teacher verification? We're already looking at Sheer ID, but would be interested in something better.
We certainly, on our side, we have developed a series of APIs that allow for access into the data, allowing for things like teacher verification. So, we currently have that available. It's something we've had for a long time that allows you to look by name and school or by email address and be able to determine validations. We drive some of the largest teacher verifications off our data set. For instance, like the Microsoft Office discount verification program we run off the data set here. So, we certainly have a lot of experience in that particular area and being able to verify teachers. But we can work very specifically to tailor that to your specific needs.
Okay, great. And there's one more question, which I think, Verlin, you kind of maybe already answered pieces of, but John B asks, what are the sources used for capturing data on educators?
Everywhere we can possibly get it. So, we get data from each of the state departments of education, various things about particular buildings, sometimes around educators, and they're in different data sets. Sometimes it's, school contact information, other times it's licensure information. So we get it there. School and district websites is probably the biggest source. Probably 70% of that comes from school and district websites. The third is direct phone calls. Like I said, we make nearly 1 million outbound phone calls a year, reaching out to gather things like enrollment or particular assignments and things where the information is not available on the website.
Yeah, on my end, and Verlin, I don't know how often this happens for you, but I will shoot back to Agile reports of data that is inaccurate immediately. So any bounce backs that I get, I shoot a report right back to them all. Or if I have an individual rep give me any intelligence that a superintendent changed their name, or they give me that feedback, we just forward it directly to one of our contacts at Agile, and they update it or research it to update.
So it's a two-way street. You're communicating back when there is outdated data.
Correct, because once they update that in their stream or in their data set, it immediately comes back to through an API to my CRM.
Yeah.
Well, and we have that same relationship with a lot of our clients, and so the one that Javier reports, other people benefit from, and the one other people report, Javier gets the benefit from that report. So, we certainly gather, we have several people on the team here that do nothing but research client update issues or questions. So, we're constantly on that, and we take those very seriously because it's a way for us to be responsive to our clients, but then also make sure that we're getting the best possible data out there for the entire kind of audience.
I have one question for Ashley, and then I want to give you each sort of time to give a last reflection. We had a question come up on Facebook about FERPA and sort of managing regulatory agencies when it comes to data. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about how you do that in higher ed, Ashley.
Sure. And I'll just make a note that I am not a compliance officer and I do not work
Yeah.
in compliance. So I'll just put that out there. But as someone who needs to participate in that, in marketing and enrollment management, a lot of what we experience in higher education is making sure that we have trainings and protocols in place, as well as parameters within our systems of who has access to what information and how often those who have access to sensitive information gets training. And a lot of those trainings are canned or packaged. FERPA regulations specifically are something that marketing and a lot of folks that work in enrollment management have to undergo at least twice a year. And we have verbal conversations about it regularly, about what is and is not acceptable to release out, including to parents, where, you know, it's you get into the heated conversations, for example, and you want to give information that simply you can't due to FERPA specifically. So a lot of what we have is built in our data governance of those checks and balances we have in place for meeting the standards of FERPA and making sure that we keep people trained with that. And so being part of the operations of those trainings being facilitated has really been my experience. But just like anything, there's no messing around with those type of things, and having those checks and balances is imperative. It's one thing to put a training out. It's another thing to track who has taken the training and completed it. And upon completion, have they answered a quiz afterwards to show that they understand the content that we are responsible for. So that's been my experience in being trained on those regulations, and then how our systems are manipulated to block off information, whether it's grades, social security numbers, etc., to users who do not need access to that information, to put some of those measures in place to comply.
That's helpful. And I think extends back to what you're talking about at the very beginning of the webinar, which is to be really thoughtful about the process at the start and lay a strong foundation. So again, thinking about those regulatory processes from the very beginning and how you do things. So we have about 8 minutes left. I want to kind of do a go round and let you each kind of give a last thought. I have one question, which is, do you have either any last tips for businesses or other agencies who might be looking to improve their data hygiene? Or is there something that keeps you up at night when it comes to data management? So I'll let you pick, but if there's not something that keeps you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, that's okay. You can give some additional tips if you have them, but anything that you might want to share with our listeners to kind of wrap up would be really helpful. Does anyone want to start? I don't want to pick on you.
I'll start. It's Javier. Okay. When you guys can see me. So what keeps me up at night is opt-out rates, and I think I talked about that already. And it ties back to everything I just keep continuously saying, is ensuring that the messages that you're sending out to your market are messages that are going to provide really quality solutions, and that you're sending the message to the right person. And it's obvious you got to have the right data in order to make sure you're talking to the right person. And then the last part that I want to kind of tie onto that is, I like to do a comparison or a metaphor. You know, if you're going to get ready to train for a marathon, which is building your business maybe as a startup, before you train for a marathon, you invest in the right type of equipment. You're going to ensure that you've invested in the right type of shoes to train for that marathon. You're not going to run in some old pair of sneakers that you picked up from the back of your closet that have been sitting there for 3 or 4 years. You're going to invest in a nice quality pair of sneakers that's right for you at that time based on your physical ability, and you're going to start training in those. Then when you hit your next marker, you're then going to upgrade those sneakers if you need to get to the next 10-mile marker that you need to in order to reach the goal for that marathon. So data is no different. The metaphor is, you know, you need to make sure that you have that foundational data, even if it's at a very basic level before you start that marathon, to get where your end goal is.
Great advice. I love the marathon metaphor. I think it works really well here. Ashley or Verlin?
Sure. I guess what keeps me up at night really is fearing we have students falling through the cracks, and our data and our systems are not supporting us and our students to identify those who need us the most as those in higher education. And so it's everything from, are we communicating appropriately on the front end before they become a student, as well as every piece of data we're collecting through their student journey. Do we have enough information, and are our systems working to notify us when someone needs our help to see through completion of a degree program? So it's all interconnected, but you know, I do wake up at night worried that something's broken, or I forgot about something, or the team forgot about something that needs to be addressed for us to protect the student experience.
I feel like that's a great point. You know, again, going back to that humanizing the data, right? Like the stakes for you are making sure that your students are getting the best learning experience, right? And the best experience in higher ed. So the stakes are quite high. So good way to kind of go back to that earlier point as well. Verlin, any tips or anxieties that you want to share with our audience?
Well, luckily I'm one of those people, I sleep like a rock, so nothing keeps me awake at night, so I don't have that. But I think to go back to kind of one of your intro slides, you were quoting the experience study of the cost of bad data. You know, one of the pieces that came out of that same study was that roughly 10% of revenue in an organization is lost due to bad data. And, you know, as a business owner, I think about that quite often. If I could gain 10% in my revenue by cleaning up dirty data issues, I'd be all over that. You know, that there's the small amount that I would spend in cleaning that up would certainly be offset by the revenue gained. And I think when you put it back into those kind of numbers, it becomes kind of a no-brainer to say, wow, this is a problem. This is what the real cost of this is. And if it's costing my business 10% of the revenue, that's a massive impact.
Huge. That's huge, no matter the size of your business, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on, I think. So what a great conversation. I have to tell you, I learned so much just on a personal level. So thank you all for teaching me and for bringing in all this great advice and your expertise from both higher ed, K-12, and of course, Verlin from Agile. We have a couple closing out slides. I want to share with you that we have compiled a list of resources from Agile, and if any resources came up in the webinar, we'll also share those as well via email. And we have recorded the webinar, so we will send that to you as a follow-up email. We're also happy to hear from you. So if you have particular topics that you would like to cover, you'd like to see us cover in webinars, you can let us know. We always appreciate your feedback. You can email us at webinars@edsurge.com. Again, huge thanks to our panel, Ashley Chitwood, Javier Encinas, and Verlin Stevens, and also to our sponsor, which is Agile Education Marketing. Again, I'm Leanna Gamber-Thompson, Digital Project and Operations Manager at EdSurge. We provide the latest resources and news about how technology is shaping the ways we learn and teach. You can sign up for our free newsletters or find more resources at edsurge.com. And to check out our other webinars, you can go to edsurge.com/e/webinars. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you tuning in and appreciate all your questions. We hope you have a great afternoon. See you next time.